Amen. So, as I said, we're kind of now we're in our final 10th week, and Jesus kind of brings things to a summary, and I'm going to use that kind of bringing it to a summary just to kind of review a little bit some of what we've thought of over the last few weeks. My hope, I just can't remember what I've got as my next slide here. Yeah, we'll go there in a minute. My hope in the process is, as we've unpacked things, there are so many different ways you could kind of cut the text up. It's always the way. So I've tried to present and show you the kind of the context into which Jesus was speaking. So by highlighting the contemporary references as well as some of the kind of the biblical background. So there's biblical background, which is the kind of thing you'll often get in church. You know, a good Bible teacher will give you the background and biblical background and so on. And very often they don't give you, for some reason, that kind of historic context. This is what people were saying in the generations around Jesus. These are the ideas that were circulating in Judea at the time. That's come to much more prevalent knowledge since the 1980s, probably. But the information has been there for over a century. So, you know, a lot of kind of work on texts and so on, and collecting the together of texts and starting to analyze and translate them and study them. That's been going on for over 100 years. But it's only really since the 1980s that we've started to get simple kind of compendiums that have been worked through, and you can look at look at them thematically, so we can start to understand the way people thought and taught. And that's a really helpful process. This is just kind of giving you background, really, to where some biblical kind of scholarship is at, in one sense, today. It opens lots of questions which do require answers, which sometimes those answers aren't the typical ones that we've been sold through the teaching at church. Not because people were trying to deceive us in any way, but just because it wasn't hitting mindsets at that point. So there are some questions that probably we would answer slightly differently as we apply this new information, but the huge majority of it actually it gives you a relatively, what you might think of as conservative with a small c approach. It actually gives us confidence in our basic understanding of the nature of the text. There are some nuances. We saw that, if you remember, when we saw that run of ideas which we find in the Talmuds, which follow the same line that Jesus does in terms of calling people names, running down their reputation, you fool, you stupid head, and then committing of adultery. And when we saw in that context that in contemporary Judaism, Gehenna wasn't so much like eternal conscious torment, which is the kind of the one of the Christian doctrine of certain denominations, that people are punished eternally in Gehenna. It was more like kind of a Catholic purgatory. So that can be a bit confusing to us. But so we have to unravel some of that. And I'm not trying to conclude things on it, but I'm just saying it's useful to see these things as we've uncovered them. So we've seen Jesus in relationship to rabbis like Hillel, Shammai, to the Essenes. We see him in the context of some of the other intertestamental writings. And so hopefully that's been really interesting for folks. It raises questions, it helps settle things as well, it helps bring focus and clarity. And then we've also looked at these things in the light of kind of modern research. A lot of it I call psychology, some of it's not, some of it's sociology. Some of it is what I'm just trying to think what the right word is. But it's just, some of it even is just mathematics. We're going to touch on a bit of that tonight. But actually just and what that should do is it gives us confidence that it's not exactly that Jesus was teaching these psychological principles. It's just that actually his teaching embodies kernels within them that address those things and make sense as we've discovered some of these things about the way we emotionally respond, and the way in which we actually are motivated to kind of present a persona which is further ahead and more moral than the actual person is. And Jesus seems to get all of those things. So it tells us that he had incredible sort of psychological wisdom without the psychological language and research that we have the privilege to today. And then, of course, we've seen background to Old Testament context and so on, as I said. So that we've hopefully done it in a way that's kind of touches several different threads. And tonight, as we go through, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the text because Jesus is kind of drawing things together. going to share a couple of ideas, some which kind of come from the intertestamental running down to the time of Jesus. And then finally, as we're going to get to the end, I'm just going to show you a kind of a modern phenomenon which seems to be referenced quite often. It's one of Jesus' most important teachings, but you might not realize what it is. But he mentions it about 5 different occasions in 5 different contexts, which actually should make it stand out. And so we're going to look at the way in which this kind of idea that Jesus get hold of is presented in modern terms under things like Price's law, the Pareto distribution, the Pareto principle, all of these, the 80-20 rule. All of these are ideas that somehow reflect this idea that Jesus presents towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So let's kind of move on. So that's my kind of summary of where we've been, perhaps how we're going to finish tonight. So we, if you remember, we started with the 8 Beatitudes. So I wanted to just kind of revisit that and that context of our understanding of the 10 Commandments. So if you remember, the 10 Commandments are recorded for us in 2 occasions, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. And it's after reviewing the law for that second time, so the second statement of the commandments in Deuteronomy, you get this verse, Deuteronomy 28. And now, if you listen seriously to the voice of Yahweh, your God, and accomplish all of his commandments, all these blessings will overtake you. And then it goes on and it proclaims 8 kind of specific things that are blessed, specific situations. Use the word blessed 8 times. So you're blessed in the city, you're blessed in the field, you're blessed with fruitfulness, which includes body, land, and animals. You're blessed in your bread basket and kneading bowl, which is very domestic. You're blessed when you come in, you're blessed when you go out. You're blessed in the land that Yahweh gives you, and you're blessed in all of the work of your hands. So just these 8 blessings. But the context of this is if you complete what God has given you, if somehow it's fulfilled. And we saw at the beginning of Matthew how Jesus talks about, I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill the law. And although it's difficult to kind of present nice simple quotes that kind of show this, it seems that the thinking in Judaism in the run up to Jesus coming, so much of what drove and gave zeal to people like the Pharisees, to the Essenes, was this desire that somehow the history of Israel had failed to understand what God's covenant was about, his commandments about. And if they could just live it, and the criteria would be debated. If just one person could live it for the one day, then it would be fulfilled. And that's a kind of an interesting thing to understand, because it shows again that the time into which Jesus came, which Paul presents as being the right time, has finally got hold of the idea that it's not so much that the 10 Commandments are, and you've got to be, I'll be careful how I'm going to say this because I understand it can be misunderstood, but it's not so much that they are there as an eternal edict, but that they were there for something developmentally that is just getting there. People are beginning to get their heads around what it's about, that there's a principle of direction. The word Torah, its root word, all Hebrew words are built from a kind of a root. Its root is used for things that point at stuff. So for instance, a sign, it's got the word, is the ut or the alth. That is part of the same word as Torah. It doesn't sound like it, but it's just the way these. Rain. Oh no, it's not Torah. Sorry, it's different. No, it's a different word. It's for things that point at. Yes, what. So it's a directional thing. Torah is something that's directional rather than destination. So it's setting a destination, but people's thinking, well, if just somebody could live it once, then someone would have done it. And there is a kind of a sense in which then God would have been proved right, that the human project would have been a success. He's made mankind, expected him to be something, and if just one person did it, then he was proved right. They could be that, if that makes sense. In the same way that for an oak tree to be successful, only one live a successful oak tree life, only one acorn needs to reproduce another tree. Millions could be produced, but as long as one does, it's been successful in its life cycle. It's reproduced after its kind, which is what the commission it was given to it. I have 3 children, so I've been successful in reproducing 3 times. It doesn't have to be every time. It just needs to be done once. And that was part of the kind of the idea and thinking. And in that context, people started to focus then on what we're given, which are the blessings that flow out of it. So the idea of 8 blessings kind of start to flow out of, if the law is fulfilled, then there's a transition and we're stepping into this new season of blessings. And so that actually in many ways overarches the whole of Jesus' ministry. It's declared here at the beginning, the Sermon on the Mount. It's concluded when Jesus fulfills and says, it's finished, on the cross. And so then there's this release of blessings, and Jesus uses that framework of blessings as he unpacks, takes us through the Sermon on the Mount. But just some other interesting kind of thoughts to kind of probably raise more questions than I get to answer. So no doubt, Colin, you'll miss the fact we don't have another session next week, so you can't get there early to to ask me a question. So Colin's always the first person who gets here, and I would say, "Oh, Colin, nice of you to turn up early." And he says, "Well, I've got a question." So I've no doubt I'm going to be raising other questions now. But the funny thing is with the 10 Commandments is it's difficult to know exactly what they are. You say, that's ridiculous. I know what they are. Well, we all agree on don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal. But the truth of the matter is, if you look through Jewish and church history, there's no agreement on exactly what the 10 are. There are, and they're never actually called the 10 Commandments in Jewish in Hebrew. That's actually an English imposition. When Wycliffe translated his Bible, he actually called them the 10 verses. I think it was the 10 verses. Because commandments is very solid and very concrete. But the Hebrew word is much more kind of, here are these declarations. They're 10 declarations. So in Judaism, even today, they're referred to as the 10 words. They're 10, and they actually, because they're 10 words, modern modern Judaism treats the first statement as the first commandment. So you think, well, it's not a commandment, I am the Lord your God. Well, that's not a commandment. Well, no, but it doesn't say commandment, it says 10 words. And they say that's a really important declaration. It's part of this covenant that it's really important that we recognise and establish that I am the Lord your God. Does that make sense? So you think, well, why do we call them 10 commandments? Because if you actually break it down, if you add up how many you shall nots and how many you shoulds there are about 13 or 14. And we just group them according to how we think that we should make 10 out of them. Does that make sense? So why do we call them 10? And my best understanding is the title is clearly inserted. That you have, if you like, now that doesn't mean to say there's anything wrong with the Bible. The insert is something that is endorsed as part of Scripture. But the way in which Scripture has come about is the final edits were being done under the Second Temple. So when we hear about Nehemiah collecting the law together and the scribes starting to rewrite it, this is the final edit at that point. So there are things, if you like, that are creeping in, commentaries, clarifications, and so on, right the way through. And the actual title, 10 Commandments, seems to be one of those things. It kind of is suddenly dropped into the middle of the sentence just as you're about to start the introduction to the law. So it's kind of the whole of the introduction is referred to as the 10 Commandments. Why? Well, probably because God creates the heavens and the earth with 10 declarations. So if you go back to Genesis 1, there are 7 times and God said, there are 7 days, but there are 10 things where God declares something. God said, let there be. God said, do this. God said, do that. So there are 10 declarations in the course of creation. And so you can see, as the rabbis were thinking, so here is this summary of the commandments, which are going to be unpacked in the flow of the document, in the same way that the Sermon on the Mount starts with 8 Beatitudes and then unpacks them in the flow of what comes after. And they kind of look at it, and someone does a quick count, and his way of breaking them up, he thinks, I think there's 10 there. And they're slightly broken up differently if you look at Exodus and Deuteronomy, even between the 2 texts we got in Scripture. So it's more of a collective statement, and that's not a problem for the ancient mindset. In the ancient world, a number was 50% symbolic and 50% actual, if that makes sense. We're less like that. For us, a number is almost 99% literal and only 1% symbolic. Well, perhaps a bit more than 1%. If I say there's a couple of folks coming and 3 turn up, you don't criticise me. If I say in about a fortnight, or if I say in a fortnight, and it's not exactly 14 nights, or whatever. We still use numbers symbolically, but it's less so. In the ancient world, that wasn't the case. And there's some fascinating work. I'm just kind of saying in actually re-looking at some of the numbers that are used, all those boring numbers, as we're beginning to kind of piece together from the ancient culture some of the symbolic meanings of the numbers. We're beginning to understand some of those things. But anyway, so the key thing is they've given it this title. It's kind of, if you like, the 10 Commandments are because here's a new covenant. It's like a new word. God speaks 10 new words, like he did to parallel the 10 words in creation, 10 new things. There are actually 360 something statements, which we summarize in a summary that can have anything, depending on how you break it up, between 8 and 14 statements. We call it the 10 Commandments, but the key thing is when it's fully fulfilled, when the direction's been got and someone's really done it, there's a breaking through and into blessing, and that's really the context. So I'm sorry I didn't really have any nice slides for that. I just had any thought before we started. Maybe I should comment on some of that. Hopefully that's kind of interesting and doesn't raise more questions than it answers.
Well,
so anyway,
can I just ask a question?
Yeah, go on then, Peter.
Is that allowed? So in terms of the 8 then, the 8 blessings and the 8 beatitudes, does the number 8 symbolise something?
Well, interestingly, it does. It's not as unambiguous as the number 7. But actually, the number 7, funnily enough, we think of as being kind of complete. It's not actually complete. The word Shabbat, which means a 7, it means a promise. It means 3 things. I'm trying to remember what the third one is. It's a promise, but the key things are it's both a promise and rest, of course. Yeah, Shabbat is rest. Yeah, so it's a kind of, so there's something is completed in the sense of now I'm resting, but there's a promise that's being given. But very often what you find is that things that come in 7 sort of anticipate a number 8. So there are 7 days of preparation for the temple, and then there's a day of kind of dedication. So 7 days of preparation completed, and then a day of dedication. So 8 is often about the fulfillment of what 7 promises. Does that make sense?
Right.
And so interestingly, I say interestingly, if you read some of my books, we all know in Revelation that that Nero 666 is the number of the beast. What some of us be aware of as well is that lots of ancient manuscripts don't say 666, they say 616. But they're actually the same number symbolically, because both of them are using the one using Greek gematria and one using Hebrew gematria. Gematria was the symbol where you took a name and you understood its number from the name. So they refer to that as gematria. Under the Hebrew system, if you take the title Nero Caesar, it produces 666. In the Greek system, if you take the name Nero Caesar, it produces 616. So it's clearly a coded reference to Nero Caesar. The trouble is that modern scholars don't think that Revelation was written while Nero was alive. I do. But most of them think it wasn't written till the 90s. And then you have to explain, why is he making a coded secret reference to Nero Caesar? It's really obvious if it was written in about 68 or 64, say 65, 66, that kind of period. Because he kind of talks about, let the reader understand. The number of this beast is 666 or 616. Let the reader understand. That is because I'm not going to say it out loud because I don't want to get into even more trouble. But we're talking about Nero. You see, it makes sense in that kind of context. Now, the thing that's interesting is, although it doesn't say it there, if you take the name Jesus, it adds up to 888. Which is it is one of those little things which I often wonder if in the ancient church they were all aware of that. That the name Jesus is 888 and actually Nero Caesar is 666. So you get this kind of contrast between the two. So you're asking about the 8s. So Jesus' name comes out as a trinity of 8s. which is I think is kind of interesting. Anyway, that's a by the by. So that's got nothing to do with the Sermon on the Mount. But I told you it would raise 1,000 questions. I find lots of questions. Of the end of asking of questions, there is no end, isn't it? Where is it? Of the asking of questions, there is no end. So let's keep going. So anyway, yeah, they've got that expectation. We find things, for instance, you find little claims in things like the Essenes in the Qumran that they kind of were trying to make a claim to reinterpreting the Ten Commandments because of the fulfillment of them in their own kind of terms. So that's part of the context. So anyway, we're coming to the end of this process, which is a really very powerful declaration, if you like, when Jesus makes it. Because he's talking about fulfillment, he's talking about a radical grace-filled reinterpretation, which was something that the Jews of his day expected would be the case. They felt that if the law was fulfilled, it would be radically revised in the same spirit and in the same direction, but with new revelation. So Jesus is providing that. And as I say, if you take what Paul says, that Jesus came at the right time, I think the context there is something for us to take seriously. You could say that, well, they were just Jews, they got it wrong. The whole point is Jesus told them they got it wrong. But he comes into a time where that's the expectation. But anyway, if we come back to the text now, having gone off on an exciting little side kind of trip. So we're coming back to the poor in spirit, because remember at the end of last week, Jesus was just unpacking what it means to be poor in spirit. So he goes through. So you enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. While the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And my only real kind of I want to comment on this is we have a real tendency. I noticed it in myself back, I don't know, it must have been in my 20s, I guess, at some point. And I started to realise it's and it is a kind of a proper sort of it's actually something that magicians use, if I can put it this way. It's not that our churches have done this unhelpfully, but if you direct someone to see a pattern in something that's not obviously there and they see it, it's very difficult for them to see anything other than that pattern. So that's how kind of mental magic works, where someone inadvertently kind of draws attention to something and therefore he knows that now you're thinking in those lines. Does that make sense? So it's just part of the way the brain works. And so one of the things I noticed was that I would read loads of text and read stuff into it, which was part of broader teaching, which it doesn't necessarily actually say in the text in its own right. Now, it's not irrelevant to do that, but sometimes I would see. My take on this when I read this now is that this isn't about people getting saved or not. This is just general principles of life, because in actual fact, my understanding of what Jesus unpacks in the Sermon on the Mount as the right way to do life looks like hard work compared to the grace that is there because of the cross, if that makes sense. But actually, it's still relevant. Jesus' words about your thought life and the way you speak and the way you use your money and your skills, which you might think of, well, they're mine anyway. Those are actually given for reasons. And if I make those into laws for salvation, they become burdens that kind of end up killing me. But if I keep them as the direction pointers, which is what I think they're supposed to be, and I find that in the context where the law has been fulfilled by one person, then in actual fact, I do well if I find the way. So while the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it, and those who find it are few, we live in a world where the majority of world's religious systems are Christian. that around 40% of the world follow Jesus. You'll regularly hear it quoted as around 30%, but I saw some interesting figures that were done. They were done actually by a Chinese sociologist, because actually the huge growth of the church, which is underreported in so many parts of the world, you can now measure, because in every nation apart from China, so it's interesting, every nation apart from China, there are secular research agencies that actually have found ways of finding out people's real religion. And it seems that the official figures have always been underreporting. That when people feel secure, they actually report more honestly. You find there's higher percentages of the world's population claiming to be Christians. So you might look at it and think, well, there aren't that few people who are finding Jesus. Okay, but there are less people who are really get hold of his core message, which really takes you into growth and fruitfulness. Does that making sense? So by taking out the context of salvation from everything that Jesus says, a huge chunk of it is about living a fruitful life. That's what he comes to give us. And actually, the truth of the matter is, huge numbers of people, even within our Christian churches, with all our good teaching, only kind of almost by accident are getting hold of the things that actually make for a fruitful and successful and rich and enjoyable and nourishing and abundant life. These are kind of just putting it here. These are the sorts of things that have been summed up in the sermon as Jesus has gone. I've because of because of the things I tend to do, I've often looked at some quite kind of unpleasant things to do with violence and the tendencies of violence that certain people have. I've looked at things like addiction, whether it's drug addictions or whether it's things like pornography addictions. And you look at so many of the things that Jesus teaches on, and actually there is increasingly now, as we look at well-being, we're discovering. So, for instance, the impact of online pornography on engagement with life is actually making people depressed, but they don't know why. They think that the only thing they enjoy is to go online late at night and bring up images and whatever. But actually, the impact it's having on the brain is it's actually leaving them with depression. It's actually killing, it's burning out the circuits that actually are full, where they get hope and enjoyment and engagement. So now there are increasing testimonies of people who have broken that addiction. Famous one, of course, is Russell Brand, who talk about how much more energy they've got and how they sleep better. That's one of the strange impacts, that the people sleep better at night and things like this. So in actual fact, when Jesus talks about getting your thought life under control, he's actually giving you a principle that makes life more abundant. It makes it more enjoyable. It's not a kind of a finger-wagging thing. And similarly, if you want to start to criticize and pull people down, you actually find it starts to leave a kind of a scarring or a tendency in you that means that you see everybody through those eyes. And so suddenly nobody is good enough. And it actually saps away and takes away life. And so the truth of the matter is, even though that there are many who find salvation, there are a few who seem to really walk in the freedoms that come, which are actually part of this growth dynamic, which I think the Sermon on the Mount is really about. And it's not just kind of, if you like, external growth. You know, if you live a righteous life, God will bless you and you'll have lots of money. It's actually a satisfied life. That actually, if you put these things in place and you get them right, then actually you savour the moments. Even when they don't seem that great by external standards, somehow it's kind of what a privilege it is to have this opportunity. So there's this, I just wanted to kind of give it that framework. Because I always remember, you read it and I used to think, I remember even having a discussion with one of my spiritual mentors as a teenager. He's saying, I really don't get it, why is it, he's trying to work out, why are there so few who find this, because it sort of offended him that Jesus kind of saying only a few people are going to get saved. But I think he probably just he's talking more generally. And I think, unfortunately, Jesus' observation is true. It's a challenge to get into, but when you get into it, it becomes something that is actually deeply fulfilling and successful or fruitful. He then he reminds us, I've broken these into couplets because they kind of make little statements as we finish. So that one was really, I've given you all this stuff, I've gone through all of these things. You need to be poor in spirit because the gate's narrow. It's a bit humiliating sometimes to go this route. It's not the way the world sees it. They're not likely to endorse you in it. They're not going to say, yeah, you go for it. And while it's small and the way is narrow, it leads to life. But those who find it are few. I often like to think as well, that if only a few people find it naturally, perhaps at least we can show a few people. So they didn't find it, but I showed them. Or you showed them. Or that the more we can share it, the less they're dependent on them accidentally stumbling across the right way. beware. He then goes on with the bewaring of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Um, I like. I think it's interesting that Jesus uses the word ravenous wolves. He's recognizing it's not that they're predatory wolves in the sense of they just kill for the sake of it. They're killing because they're hungry. That there will be those who come who see, if you like, the dynamics and the benefits, just as he's already taught when he's taught through about how you practice your righteousness. Don't do it for an audience. Don't put on the sad face like the actors do, but do it for the right reasons. He recognizes that there's a kind of a hunger in people. That means that in one sense they're ravenous, which actually makes them dangerous. Because they come in and suck up the attention, they suck up the kudos, they suck up those things. And by their fruits you will know them. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Again, I've quoted them a couple of times while we've done this. I've probably got one more tonight. I remember seeing Jordan Peterson in a debate on something making the statement that he finds Jesus' statement about knowing people by their fruits is so incredibly helpful. He said, because the truth is people are always saying, nobody says that they're a bad person, everybody says they're good, but actually look at what they do. And you know, I won't try and I won't cast any aspersions on groups or whatever, but it's a very real thing. Nobody ever says I'm really terrible and I'm really out for destruction. So in the end, everybody likes to think that they're in it for the best of everybody. So you actually do have to look at actually how fruitful folks are. And it is really important that we try and find others who genuinely are fruitful in both dimensions. Remember, we're talking about understanding they do things that are good for them and good for others. Both dimensions, two things: loving others as they love themselves. That if you can find those folks who are growing in those ways, producing fruit in those ways, try and hang out with them at a very kind of simple level. And it is just interesting how unfortunately things do kind of go round and around. So just because it's my age, so I was just going to suddenly think, you know, the song "Do It Again." That's right, by Steely Dan. Do It Again. That's all about people who keep going around, you know, the wheel turning round and around. They keep going around the same cycle of destruction. That is something that just kind of happens. Because likewise, every good tree grows good fruit, but a bad tree grows bad fruit. A good tree can't grow bad fruit, and a bad tree can't grow good fruit. Now, I love that little statement because there is a kind of faith dimension in it. And I quoted this one earlier when Colin asked me a question, I think it was before we started, that I always found it really helpful, this verse from Jeremiah, when I felt the Lord was challenging me to give more prophetic words to people. I'm thinking, well, I don't know, I haven't got a clue if I'm getting it right. And that what Jesus says, or what God says to Jeremiah when he says the same thing, I can't do it, I'm not going to get it right. He says, I'll watch over my word to perform it. So in other words, is if you do it out of the right spirit, out of obedience and in submission and so on, actually I will watch out. And I think there's something wrapped up here in this. A good tree can't produce bad fruit. A bad tree can't really grow good fruit. That there is something about, if we come in with that poor in spirit attitude, that dependent attitude, it's not about us getting it perfectly right. It's about us acting faithfully within that spirit, that somehow that produces good fruit in the longer term. And actually you get these little testimonies that kind of come back. And it is really nice. I'm sure others have had the same experience, but you know, I often will find stories that go back years, and people suddenly say, yeah, when you did this, and I think, oh right, I never knew. And so I just think that it's not about something we've achieved, but it is about how the way we do it in that right submissive place, somehow the Lord takes it. Even if we get the choice right or wrong, is less relevant than we did the spirit was right or wrong. We did it in those right ways. And every tree that doesn't grow good fruit is cut down or thrown in the fire. So then, it's probably why we like to see this as an eternal judgment statement. But I think he's just using an analogy. You know what we do with it goes in the rubbish. So then, by their fruit you'll know them. You'll know them by their fruit. And so Jesus kind of clarifies it a little bit with the next couple of verses. So, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Again, we've got this contrast with the kingdom of heaven, which is more than just salvation. And the kingdom of heaven is kind of coming into line with the authority of God. So not everybody who says it, who's claiming it, actually is part of that flow, part of that system. So the challenge here is not about are you someone who's saved? Probably the fact that you're following Jesus at this point means you are. The challenge is, are you one of those who's salting and lighting and leavening society? And is there something of his authority flowing through your life? Is somehow what you're doing producing fruit around you? Is it lifting up the nation, or is it just kind of become part of the dragging down? Oops, there's a note there from that Anne put in for me, and I forgot to take out. And then many will say to me on that day, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we drive out demons in your name and perform many miracles? However, I'll tell them, those lawless workers, I never knew you. Depart from me. And part of the reason I started with the Sermon on the Mount is because we got this little phrase, those lawless workers. Because remember, Jesus said, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And so there's something about the foundational things that he's taught in the Sermon on the Mount, which are about growing law in us. And if you stop and you understand it in these simple ways, the Ten Commandments again and the Old Testament commandments have a cultural context where God is setting a direction for a culture that is then going to produce synagogues and rabbis, and then it's going to be able to teach Jesus as a child how to read. It's going to teach him the stories. It's going to give him direction. It's going to help shape him so he becomes the man that God wants him to be. So those commandments have set a direction for Israel, which is quite profound. Things like, for instance, which we might take trivially, don't eat pork and don't eat shellfish. Okay, so you could look at those and you say, well, so as a result, the Israelites never got absorbed into the seafaring communities up the coast because they all ate shellfish. You see, so somehow they stayed distinct from those. And they never got dragged down into pig rearing, which pig rearing is not like, it doesn't leave you as flexible. It's a very limited economic model. It's one of those things that economists looked at, the difference why it is so both of them offer kind of quick returns. or one's a quick return and one's a kind of a cultural thing. But actually you could say, well, those laws, they stopped them doing those things. That actually has helped preserve Israel through the millennia. As a unique culture. Maybe that's all they meant. I don't know if it is. I'm just saying maybe that's all they were there for. But when Jesus comes along, what he's saying is those laws were there and they were given to you, but let's understand the laws beneath the laws. Let's go a level down. So you were told not to commit adultery, but actually it's because somehow you've got to get the desires that God put in you for reproduction have got to be given direction and shape, and they've got to be brought under control. They've got to be made meek, like a warhorse, that its strengths are under control. Those laws about not murdering, well, they were there and they were setting a direction, but really we're driving at how well do you get on with your neighbour? Do you actually think ill for them? Do you dream about it? Do you plan it, but you just don't act on it? Let's get right down to the heart. Do you see the way what Jesus is doing is he's going for the law beneath the law. And so if we're getting hold of what he gives us, it will still produce law-like behaviour in us. It will bring about external law conformity. But it's not because we've internalised the external law, we've actually internalised the deeper law. And that produces actions that then comply with the outer law. So I end up not being a murderer. But that doesn't mean to say I might be casual one day and kill someone with my car. But actually there's something I've internalized which was deeper than just the simple tick box. Does that make sense? So actually those people who are doing that, but I will tell them, you're lawless. I never knew you. Depart from me. Now I always like the fact that they actually do drive out demons and they do perform many miracles, and I think that's a sign of God's grace. That the Miracle Crusade comes to town, and I, in my faith, I go along, and the guy's a total huckster and con merchant selling snake oil, but the Lord actually meets me in my faith and grace, and people leave healed. And the Lord loves the person who's doing that, who's probably self-deceiving, but just because they're involved in it, they don't really know him. They haven't got that heart message, that transformational message. Is that hopefully making sense? So everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So we know this image so well. One of the earliest songs I can ever remember from my childhood. So the rain comes down, the floods go up. The rain fell, the torrents came, and the winds blew and beat on the house. But it didn't fall, as its foundation was on the rock. This kind of classic image. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them, so they're hearing them, but they're now not doing them. They've heard them, but actually in rejecting them, there's something there as well. They're like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Even that, just to kind of quickly go back to where you're right at the beginning, Jesus says he's like a foolish man. It's not the same as bringing kind of, if you like, condemnatory judgment, you fool. I know when someone is telling me lies, but I don't have to box them and say you liar. If that makes sense. You can recognize you recognize the actions, but you don't want to lock people into that's all I can say about them. But they're like a foolish person who's built his house on sand. The rain fell, the torrents came, the winds blew, they beat on the house, and it fell, and its collapse was massive. The word's got hooper in it. It's a kind of hyper. It's got the word hyper in it. It's hyper big. It's really enormous. So it's not just that it doesn't do well, but it actually collapses. It kind of looks good, but it falls. It kind of, and that unfortunately is the tragedy of when things weaken. And I'm very conscious of it because I see institutions all over the Western world, particularly the Western world, probably wider, which look so solid, but are beginning to show the signs of crumbling and collapse. And so then you say, well, okay, so have they lost, if you like, the foundation of some of these things? And it reminded me as I was thinking about it that although it doesn't appear explicitly in the Sermon on the Mount, it's there a couple of times implicitly. Is this statement that Jesus makes 4 or 5 times, I think it is, which is sometimes referred to as being the Pareto principle or Price's law, or sometimes the 80-20 rule. But it's actually even sometimes referred to since 1968, I think it was, a sociologist who called it the Matthew principle. Something that's been observed in about 4 different separate locations, which is why it's got so many names. Which in their different ways, they have different immediate contexts, but as a general principle, you start to see something emerging. So in Matthew, which is Matthew 13, so outside the Sermon on the Mount, you get this statement. So he answered them and said, to you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom. Okay, so there's something here he's about to deliver, which is a secret of the kingdom. But to them it's not been given. For to him who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And this concept of, as you start to work with something you've got, it multiplies, is actually profoundly written in not just to human biology, but even into the laws of physics of the universe. And I just think it's fascinating that Jesus calls it a kind of effectively it's a secret of the kingdom. So I just want to unpack it a little bit from a social sense, a secular sense, and see it in the principles of Jesus. So Jesus restates that 4 more times. So it's twice he says it after the parable of the talents, so which gives it a financial twist, Matthew and Luke. And twice he uses it after the illustration of you don't keep a lamp under a bushel or under a bowl, which is something he's taught in the Sermon on the Mount, but he didn't explicitly finish it that time, although he does in Mark and in Luke. In Matthew, he doesn't explicitly finish it with the statement, this is a kind of secret of the kingdom, to him who has more is given, and so on. So what's going on here when he says it? Because I remember used to read it and think, well, that's a bit unfair of God. He's kind of like, well, I've given you some, now I'm going to give you more. But actually, this is more observational. This is the way the world works. This is the way sociology works. It's the way physiology, and psychology works, and it's the way even elements of physics work, is there's this kind of multiplying effect. So there's an Italian economist, a guy called Pareto, back in the 19th century, who first observed that in terms of land wealth, and so he started to look at wealth, that the more people had, the more they got, if that makes sense. And so they started to apply it in different places. And actually, one of the things you discover is in any system whereby there is a kind of a skill involved that produces accumulation, as that skill starts to kind of work its way through, dynamics start to kick in that accelerate the process. So the Pareto distribution is a distribution that kind of shows, if you like, at the bottom end things are packed together, and at the top end they're really spread out. But the funny thing is, the shape is exactly the same wherever you cut it. And that's a really kind of key part of this. So in other words, I could sit here and moan about the top 1% of the world who own this huge chunk and percentage of the world's population, world's wealth. If we were to get rid of them, say let's ignore them totally, so let's just now consider everybody except the top 1% because they own 30% of the world's wealth, the same thing would be true of what's left. The top 1% would still own the huge chunk of the world's wealth. And so it goes down, because it's not that actually we're equally banded. This kind of thing stretches out. Does that make sense? And this is, so Jesus is highlighting here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about the building of houses, and there's houses that stand and there are houses that fall. Because actually the things that cause us to fall or keep growing are often very small in their implications, but enormous in their impact. And so as we look at this principle, as to say, first of all, observed by the Pareto distribution, so it's an observation, not a rule, holds in all sorts of scenarios. Occupational health and safety, in other words, places that are dangerous to work have 80%, the 80-20%, 80-20 rule is often the way we refer to it as shorthand. That's only true under certain, if you like, parameters in his distribution. You know, if you change some of the variables, but the shape is always the same. The exact split varies depending on context. And we often summarize it by talking about, it's the 80-20 rule. So the 80% of kind of accidents happen in 20% of workplaces, if I have to put it that way. That's a kind of simple summary of it. It's true of crime. 80% of crime is committed by 20% of criminals. Whether it's 80-20 is not the issue. It's the way that actually these things kind of work. Software fixing, in other words, which Barry will remember all about from his working career days. You can actually fix lines of software, and what you find is that people who fix lines of software, they do 80% of them are found by 20% of the people who go looking for them. Reading and learning, which is really key, which is that 20% of readers read 80% of the stuff. It's not so true now, but back in the 80s, Christians used to read 8 times as much as non-Christians. That's just a fact. Just a little. I know that from Hodder and Stoughton, secular publisher, who published a book that I wrote back in those days, and they did a little presentation for us as Christian writers. They said one of the things you should know is that our is the reason why we spend money, even though we're not Christians, on pushing Christian books. Is because at the moment, although it's changing, Christians read 8 times as much as non-Christians. So anyway, 80% of stuff that is read by 20% of readers. 80% of prize money in sports is won by 20% of the professionals. And it's not just that 80-20. You can kind of break what you get is that a small percentage improvement actually produces huge outputs and rewards. And as I say, it works works internally in psychology, it works interpersonally in relationships, and it works in physics. This kind of rule, you can find it applying all over the place. So when Jesus says, "To him who has, more gets given," he really is hitting at something very fundamental. Price's law is a similar. It's not quite the same. Price's law is actually a rule that you can apply, you can predict with. But he and is also commonly equated with the 80-20. You see, they're all but they're roughly capturing the same thing. So Price's law you can think of like this: 50% of work is done by the square root of the total number of people who participate in the work. So that sounds kind of complicated, but what it means is if you've got a team of 10 people, 50% of the workload is being done by 3 of them. Okay, because the square root of 10 is 3 point something. Does that make sense? Square root of 10 is 3 point something. Actually, you find that 3% will do over 50% of the work. So if you've got a company of 10, 3 of them, if you've got a company of 100,000, 100 of them in your 100,000 people are actually producing half the results. And both of these things, all of these ideas are really driving at the same thing, which is small increments seem to have a kind of a cycling up effect, and which actually creates a disproportionate benefit from for not doing it. And that's really key to get our heads around, because when we look at the things that are falling apart all over the world, there is no simple fix, because they grew to where they came to because 100 people made a small increment, and actually those find that those things were added to them, that a small improvement in their punctuality, a small improvement in their discipline at getting up, a small improvement in their honesty, a small improvement produced a disproportionate reward that meant that they started to kind of float up towards the top. And in the same way, if you start to slacken things off, then actually you get a disproportionate, you think, oh, it doesn't really matter. It's only 10 minutes late. It's only a little lie. Do you see the impacts? Those little things multiply, and the big little things multiply up and they multiply down, and they create this split, this divergence. Which is why something which we don't understand because we grew up in it. But I remember growing up with folks from all over the world, Christian people. They'd say one of the things you don't understand is the benefit you have of having a long history of honest government, things like this. And that honest government was kept to account because there were little honest people in there, and somehow that thing got multiplied. And it lasted for longer, and so the whole nation benefits from that little history that comes down to small increments of honesty, small increments of truth, small increments of competence, small increments of reducing their jealousies and all of those sorts of things. And so I kind of, although it's not quite there in I've maybe forced it a little bit, but it's sort of there running through the Sermon on the Mount. And it's such an important principle. I thought it was just worth kind of finishing with that observation. So when Jesus had finished these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. And, we're still teaching it today because it's still surprising. Hopefully it's been surprising as we kind of gone through some of what we've done while we're here. Because he taught on his own authority and not as their scribes. And hopefully we've seen a little bit, as we've kind of gone through over the last few weeks, that the way the scribes were teaching, it was so roundabout, and it was always quoting other people and kind of deferring and trying to help get people to kind of see how clever I was as a teacher. But Jesus actually comes down and gives really helpful advice, really helpful principles, which are actually there to sow into us the things we need to have that full life, the abundant life. And having come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. So he's gone up the mountain, and a handful of disciples have gone up with him. But once he's come down, actually, as the way it sits in Matthew's Gospel, it's kind of introduction. He's now going to tell the story of how the great crowds come. So here's the teaching for those who went up the mountain. He's come down the mountain, and now, as those disciples who've gone with him, we're going to see this multiplication actually in Jesus' life and amongst the group that's following him. So that's actually all I've sort of prepared for this evening. So we have been not too we've been just under an hour. So I did say we'd be a bit shorter tonight. I just want to say a big thank you for anyone who's made gifts. It's really helpful. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. But anyone want to ask any questions at this point? And it would be also just interesting as well if everyone could perhaps comment on what they found useful during the program as we've run through it. So that's always a dangerous thing to ask. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move my Zoom slides onto my other screen so I can see your faces. Oops. Oh, why won't it move? Can't seem to do that. Oh, I know what it is. Hang on. I know what I've got to do. I've got to let's go to that view. Okay, brilliant. Nobody wants to say anything? Ask questions? Or?
Well, one thing I was going to say is that the Matthew principle, which I must admit I hadn't sort of quite so directly linked to the Sermon on the Mount, but certainly I've noticed it. I'm going to explore that because that's interesting. But I've certainly noticed it as something that Jesus says a lot, or repeatedly, and it's certainly in terms of the world of business, that I've worked in, and economics. It's enormously relevant, and you can see it in all directions. And it to the extent that it almost seems completely unfair. It's successful companies become more successful, failing companies, generally speaking, struggle. You're either caught in a virtuous circle and you're moving forward, or you get caught in a vicious cycle and you can't escape from it. And whether you look at businesses or the economies of nations, you see it, or the wealth of individuals, you see it at sort of every level. So it is very interesting that Jesus, he uses that, or puts it forward as as part of. He presents it as something good, if you like, that God is doing in the world. So it's almost like a shocking.
It's a shocking truth, yeah. And so the
truth,
the way it works, because it varies, but basically when you strip it back, if you have a system with complex feedback, so it's not simple one thing, but where there's complex feedback, it seems that statistically the small improvement feeds back in so many small different ways from different places that's why the guy who coined the phrase in, I think it was 1968, was a psychologist, the Matthew principle. But Pareto was a century before, looking at economics. So you have economics, you have sociology, Price's law, which was to do with fruitfulness of people working, how much work they produce. And so although they're all slightly different in what they're all kind of coming back to the fact that where there's a complex feedback system, which organic life has, an awful lot of just normal physical chemical life has, an awful lot of sociological life and political life, all of these things that are complex with complex feedbacks, there's a kind of an aggregating principle that means a small benefit which means a step up in a good direction, not hits so many kind of little chains that feed back that the feedback grows, if that makes sense. And as an observation, it's good that Jesus draws our attention to it, because it seems to be hardwired into the physics of the universe, and somehow it's worked its way all the way into our sociological feedback mechanisms. And so where there is growth, more grows. And the reason that can seem unfair, but actually at least it's more helpful if we understand that is the way the world works. Because then I can think to myself, I'm not trying to achieve this, I'm just going to try and achieve this. But with fruit and good fortune, i.e. the Lord looks after me, that little bit of growth will kind of add up over time, Yeah. And in time, actually, I will suddenly discover I'm far more competent than I ever thought I could be. And from a learning point of view, 100%, I recognize it myself. I kind of know when I start to learn something new that I'm struggling with this today, but in 2 years' time, this will seem trivial. And it is that kind of thing. You take your little steps, and suddenly they multiply, and you're now making bigger steps. So,
and I think when you get past the sort of the sort of seeming unfairness of it, actually it's a kind of I mean, it would be a strange thing if we followed Jesus' teaching and lived wisely, and there wasn't any kind of reward or benefit or blessing from that. And actually, that the good news is, if you like, and that when we do build our lives on wisdom and His truth, and and on being willing to sacrifice, etc., that actually there is benefit and blessing coming from it, and that becomes something that then can overflow and bless other people as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think when we get our mindset right, if you like, we can see that that's actually something that can produce a huge amount of benefit.
It's one of those funny things, is you're exactly right, Peter, which is you can look at it and it can feel like that's unfair,
Yeah.
But actually there's a different, fairness is a very nebulous concept, and actually you can cut anything that seems unfair, you can probably cut another way and then it looks really fair. Justice is a much more concrete thing. Justice is the choices I make. Fairness is rather nebulous because it's so many different things flowing in. But the reality in one, it's a bit like when Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the laws are given actually to be a blessing for us. The Sabbath was supposed to be a blessing. Keeping the Sabbath, if you're doing it right, you suddenly discover it's a blessing. It can seem like a chore at first, but actually you're suddenly going to find you've got more energy and mental space and because you're keeping Sabbath. And you're engaged with the Lord and you're keeping him first, and so suddenly you're getting the benefits, but at first it feels like a chore. So I think it is a really important thing to get our heads around, that it can seem unfair when you're sitting there looking at someone who's got more than you, but it is an incredibly powerful principle to motivate me to say, so I'm going to grow a little bit, so if I continue looking at that person, I may never decide to grow. If I can forget him and just say, but if I do this, then actually it will produce that. Then it's very motivational.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed the looking at the sort of the historical context and how it fitted in with the thinking around that time.
Yeah.
Because I've not heard a lot of that before.
No. I think it's tricky because I do understand that on Sundays or whatever on a church, people don't want to necessarily go into those levels of stuff. But then the trouble is, if we never do, we never actually kind of discover those deeper. We never get that deeper perspective. So I understand why it doesn't happen so much, but it's a shame for people who want to go.
It certainly opens it up in a different way.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been great to sort of see things from a wider perspective. I mean, you mentioned that the numbers, the 666 thing today, and you get all sorts of arguments. But when you understand the historical context and the culture that these things were said in, they make more sense.
Yeah.
Or like the narrow gate, not referring to salvation, things like that. And I've made lots of notes, so there's just lots of really helpful nuggets from looking at the whole thing from a bit of a wider perspective.
Yeah, and you can understand that thing with the narrow gate. If you only see your faith as about going to heaven or not, then you will only see everything Jesus teaches about whether you go to heaven or not. But actually, he does say, "I came to give you an abundant life," and he does say you'll be good for other people around you. So there's also a here and now context to it, and that's just one of those things. It's helpful because it allows us in our mind to try and sort the different things out. Is this something that Jesus is saying that has an eternal, or is it temporal? Because actually both are part of his agenda. So
yeah. One thing I've appreciated is the way in which you've hit us with so many different directions. Neurobiology, be it history, be it scripture, be it contemporary culture. And all of this is feeding into give us a deeper understanding of Jesus.
Yeah.
I've appreciated that. I mean, I like the diversity of it. I mean, we can look for sort of easy ways of improving, but of course it's not easy. It's not just a self-help manual, but it's a pointer, as you say.
Yeah, it's a pointer in the direction
of life, isn't it?
Yeah. And we really do need, which we haven't particularly touched on because it hasn't been part of this agenda, but we really do need the Spirit's help in it. As I think in the first week we kind of highlighted that Paul takes the developmental line, but he's also, of course, he's saying, but we've got the Holy Spirit to help us in this process. Jesus is setting the direction, but the process, Paul says, but we've got the helper, fortunately. So I don't understand what he's doing, but he effectively intervenes. He huper entic on my behalf, and that's the way God wants it.
Yes, it's as though the principles themselves work, but with the help of the Spirit, they work so much better.
Yeah, that's exactly the conclusion I've come to, is that which is why I quite enjoy doing what I do in a secular context, which is that the principles work because you're human. But actually, of course, the advantage we have is we have the Spirit who's intervening on our behalf in ways that we don't think to ask, and actually encouraging us and lifting our spirits and doing the things we can't do. But there are still useful things. So society is better if everybody decides not to commit adultery. But actually, it's really expressing the good when somehow the Spirit's transformed and changed, and actually we're valuing each other for humanity, not just for sexual gratification, all that sort of thing. So the Spirit's done something deeper, but we still benefit if we just do the right thing in the right direction. Good.
That was really interesting, Kristen. Thank you. Very helpful. Just remind us how or why 666 or 616 equals Nero and 888 equals.
Okay, so it starts with the Jews in diaspora and the scribes, and so they because they're very keen on getting the text that they're copying correct. They start playing number games with it, so you can kind of keep tracks with the numbers, keeping counts on what's going on. So every number has various values, because they have, as I say, they often have symbolic values. So every letter, has various number values. It has a simple ordinal number value, and sometimes it has symbolic ones. The ordinals are just simply, there are 22 characters, I think it is, in the Hebrew alphabet. Yeah, 22 in the Hebrew. There's 24 in the Greek. So so they, the first 10 numbers kind of represent the numbers 1 to 10, and then they start representing kind of multiples of 10. So in Greek, and so that was the kind of Jewish way, and so if you wrote things in Hebrew, you had a certain way of adding those numbers together. In Greek, there are 24 letters in the alphabet. So what the scribes did is because a lot of Greek is a very common language for Jewish people to speak. More Jews spoke Greek than spoke Hebrew, because more Jews lived outside of Greece than lived outside of Jerusalem than lived in it, because the empire had spread them all over. Alexander had spread them all over the empire. They were all speaking Greek. In the Greek system, there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, so they broke it into 3 groups of 8. So 8 plus 8 plus 8. So then you think, so the first 8 characters represented the numbers 1 to 8. The next 8 characters 10 to 80, and so on. And they had ways of adding things up to get the other bits. So basically, if you wrote someone's name in Hebrew, so Neron Kaiser is Hebrew for Nero Caesar, you take all the letters and you add them up as ordinal, just as simple ordinals, not the symbolic numbers, but they're kind of what they add up. It adds up to 666. You add up just the name Jesus, but you write that one in Greek, and it comes out as 888. So that system, as a kind of becomes a mystical system. So you find it becomes part of the Kabbalah, but actually it goes way back, goes right the way back to just the ancient scribes doing number checks and playing around with number counts and so on, that they started to develop a system. So, for instance, the name David equates to the number 14, and so which is probably why Matthew's Gospel highlights that you can break Jesus's genealogy into 3 groups of 14. You see, because that's a Davidic number. The number 14 becomes associated with King David because David adds up to 14. That's that simple reason. So you start in people's thinking, the numbers of people's names start to kind of highlight something or say something occasionally. And so there are a number of significant names that add up to certain things, and then they'd kind of flag that and, oh, look at that, you've got this number the same as so and so. So at one level we can look at it as sort of superstition, because obviously if you get too dogmatic about it, it becomes that. But actually, it's not just actually in Jewish culture. But I saw a comment by a historian to say that the educated classes in the ancient world were incredibly adept at numerical concepts. So they didn't know complex maths like calculus, but in their education, they often knew all the triangular numbers. So, for instance, at the end of John's Gospel is got full of numbers that, if you look at them, they're all triangular numbers. They're not squared numbers; they're triangle numbers. Now, I can't run that sequence off for you today because we know so much other maths. We know calculus. We know this, that, and the other. A triangle number is just if you build 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and you add them up, you get a triangle. So John's Gospel, there's a number of observations, like the number of fish at the end of John's Gospel, and he points out that loads of these in John are actual triangle numbers, and it's probably because John comments on them because he recognises them, and probably other educated people would also recognise them, and because you find that in the ancient world that people are aware of those kinds of numbers, if that makes sense. So if there is a certain educational level, they're kind of aware of some of these number connections. They can't do deep calculus, but they know they're much more familiar with the significance of certain numbers. So yeah, so 666. That I suspect in the church everybody would have got. They would have known who he was talking about there. You know. Yep. Any other thoughts or comments? It's good actually finish a bit early because it gives longer to ask as we're getting to the end. I can see Barry is praising away, but he always is every week, so I don't know if he's really there or not. The other Barry, that is. No. Well, maybe it would be nice just to, if from my point of view, it'd be helpful if folks could just say one of the things that they really found helpful over the course of the weeks we've done.